Michael Palmer's GPS device showed that he had veered 3 miles off the Appalachian Trail and walked straight along an impossible cliff. But that was physically impossible. Among Appalachian Trail hikers, there was a legend, the Trail Angel, mysterious strangers who helped lost hikers. Michael's family believed he had encountered one. They were right. But this angel didn't lead him to safety. It led him to his end. And the question that still remains, why did Michael Palmer trust this person so completely? April 14, 2013 began as one of those perfect spring days that draw thousands of hikers to the Appalachian Trail. The temperature hovered around 68 degrees. The sky was cloudless, and the dogwood trees that lined the North Carolina section of the trail were in full bloom. For experienced hikers like Michael Palmer, days like this were exactly why the Appalachian Trail existed, offering a temporary escape from the complexities of modern life into something pure and simple. One foot in front of the other, mile after mile through some of America's most beautiful wilderness. Michael Palmer was 19 years old that spring, a sophomore at North Carolina State University studying environmental science. He wasn't your typical college student who occasionally went on a weekend camping trip. Michael had grown up hiking. His father, Robert Palmer, had introduced him to the Appalachian Trail when Michael was just 7 years old, and over the following 12 years, Michael had hiked significant portions of the 2,190-mile trail that stretches from Georgia to Maine. By the time he was 19, Michael had completed the trail in sections 12 times, knew the North Carolina portions like the back of his hand, and had begun volunteering as an informal trail guide, helping less experienced hikers navigate challenging sections. On that April morning, Michael woke up at 5:30 a.m. in his apartment in Raleigh, excited about a solo day hike he'd been planning for weeks. His mother, Sarah, had made him promise to text her every hour, a condition Michael had initially protested but eventually agreed to. Sarah Palmer was a high school English teacher who had learned to manage her anxiety about her son's hiking obsession by requiring regular check-ins. Michael's father, Robert, a construction foreman, trusted their son's experience and judgment completely, but he also understood his wife's need for reassurance. Michael loaded his Honda Civic with his hiking gear at 6:15 a.m. His preparation was methodical and thorough, the routine of someone who took wilderness safety seriously. His backpack contained 3 liters of water, high-energy snacks, a first aid kit, emergency blanket, whistle, compass, topographical maps of the area, and a satellite emergency beacon that could summon help even in areas without cell coverage. Around his neck hung a GPS tracking device, a Garmin unit he'd received as a birthday gift from his parents the previous year. The device would record his exact location every 30 seconds, uploading data to a cloud server whenever it detected cell signal. Michael's plan for the day was straightforward. He would hike a 14-mile loop on a section of the Appalachian Trail he'd completed at least 20 times before. The route started at the newfound Gap parking area, followed the trail north for 7 miles, then looped back on a parallel trail. Even at a leisurely pace with stops for photos and lunch, Michael expected to complete the hike in about 6 hours, putting him back at his car by early afternoon. At 7:42 a.m., Michael sent his first text to his mother. Starting out. Weather is perfect. Trail conditions look great. Love you. Sarah read the message while drinking her morning coffee and smiled. Her son's enthusiasm for hiking still puzzled her slightly. She preferred her nature experiences to involve less physical exertion, but she'd learned to appreciate how happy the trail made him. The first few hours of Michael's hike were utterly unremarkable, exactly what he'd expected from a familiar trail on a beautiful spring day. His GPS tracker recorded his steady progress along the trail, showing him maintaining a consistent pace of about 2 miles per hour, which was typical for the moderately challenging terrain. At 8:47 a.m. he texted his mother, "Made it to the first overlook. Visibility is incredible today. Can see for miles." He attached a photo showing the stunning vista, with mountain ridges stretching into the distance under a brilliant blue sky. At 9:53 a.m., saw a family of deer about 20 feet from the trail, also a really cool salamander, taking lots of pictures. At 10:48 a.m., halfway point, taking a break for lunch. Trail is pretty empty today, only seen about 6 other hikers. At 11:52 a.m., heading back now, should be at the car by 2:30-ish. This has been an awesome day. Sarah Palmer received each text with a mixture of relief and happiness. Her son was safe, enjoying himself, doing what he loved. She went about her Saturday morning running errands, grocery shopping, cleaning the house, checking her phone periodically for Michael's updates. At 12:47 p.m., Michael sent what would be his final text message. "Weather's still perfect. Making great time. See you tonight for dinner." The message showed nothing unusual, no distress, no indication that anything was wrong. The GPS data from that moment showed Michael exactly where he should be, on the trail, moving at his normal pace toward the parking area. What happened in the next 13 minutes would perplex investigators for 6 years, and ultimately reveal something about the Appalachian Trail that nobody had ever suspected. At 1 p.m., Michael Palmer's GPS tracker recorded him leaving the marked trail. This wasn't particularly unusual. Experienced hikers sometimes step off the trail for various reasons: to get a better view, to investigate something interesting, to find privacy for a bathroom break. But Michael didn't step a few feet off the trail. The GPS data showed him moving quickly and purposefully away from the trail, heading into unmarked wilderness in a direction that made no logical sense. At 1:03 p.m., Michael's GPS showed him a quarter mile off trail, moving at a speed that suggested jogging or fast walking. The terrain in this direction was rough, covered in dense undergrowth and rocky outcroppings that would make rapid movement difficult. At 1:07 p.m., Michael's GPS coordinates placed him at the edge of a ravine that local trail maps identified as impassable without technical climbing equipment. The ravine featured a sheer cliff face dropping 200 feet into a boulder-strewn creek bed below. At 1:13 p.m., Michael Palmer's GPS tracker showed him at the bottom of that ravine, nearly a mile from the Appalachian Trail, in terrain that experienced rock climbers described as extremely dangerous to descend without ropes and safety equipment. At 1:14 p.m., Michael Palmer's GPS signal stopped transmitting. If you're finding this investigation compelling, take a moment to subscribe and hit that like button. Cases like Michael's need attention to ensure families get the answers they deserve. Sarah Palmer expected her son's next text around 1:50 p.m. When it didn't arrive, she wasn't immediately concerned. Michael sometimes got caught up photographing wildlife or talking with other hikers and forgot to text exactly on schedule. At 2:15 p.m., when she still hadn't heard from him, Sarah sent a text. "Everything okay? Let me know you're safe." The message showed as delivered but wasn't read. At 2:30 p.m., Sarah called Michael's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She left a message. "Hey, sweetie, just checking in. Text me when you get this." She told herself not to worry. Cell coverage on the trail was spotty, and Michael probably just didn't have signal at the moment. By 3 p.m., Sarah's casual concern had evolved into active worry. She called Robert, who was working a construction job across town. "Michael hasn't checked in," she told him. "He was supposed to be back at his car by 2:30. Something might be wrong." Robert Palmer understood his wife's anxiety but also trusted his son's abilities. "Give it another hour," he suggested. "You know how Michael loses track of time when he's out there. He's probably fine." But Robert also cut his workday short and headed home, just in case. At 3:30 p.m., Sarah called Michael's phone again. This time it went straight to voicemail, suggesting the battery had died or the phone was powered off. Sarah's worry transformed into genuine fear. Michael was meticulous about keeping his phone charged. He wouldn't let the battery die without texting her first. At 4 p.m., Robert arrived home to find Sarah pacing in their kitchen, calling Michael's phone every few minutes. "I'm calling the Rangers," Sarah said. Robert nodded. If something had happened on the trail, a sprained ankle, getting disoriented, any kind of emergency, the sooner search and rescue got involved, the better. Sarah called the ranger station for the Pisgah National Forest, which managed the section of the Appalachian Trail where Michael had been hiking. She spoke with Ranger Jennifer Walsh, a 10-year veteran who had coordinated numerous search and rescue operations. Sarah explained that her son had been hiking alone, that he'd missed multiple scheduled check-ins, and that his phone was now going straight to voicemail. Ranger Walsh asked the essential questions. What was Michael wearing? What equipment did he have? What was his planned route? Did he have any medical conditions? Was he an experienced hiker? Sarah provided all the details, her voice shaking as the reality of the situation crystallized. Her son was missing somewhere in thousands of acres of wilderness, and darkness would fall in about 4 hours. Ranger Walsh assured Sarah that they would begin a search immediately. She activated the park's search and rescue protocol, calling in additional rangers and notifying the local volunteer search and rescue team. Walsh also asked Sarah a question that would prove crucial. "You mentioned Michael had a GPS tracker. Do you have access to the tracking data?" Sarah did. Michael's Garmin device synced with a cloud-based service that allowed his parents to see his location in real time. Sarah pulled up the tracking website on her computer, and what she saw confused her. The last recorded position showed Michael nearly a mile off the Appalachian Trail, in an area that looked like empty wilderness on the map. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah told Ranger Walsh. "Michael knows that trail perfectly. Why would he be way out there?" Ranger Walsh asked Sarah to email her the GPS tracking data immediately. Within 20 minutes, Walsh was studying the data with growing concern. The tracking information showed Michael leaving the trail at 1 p.m. and moving rapidly into rough terrain, ending at a location that Walsh knew well, and knew was extremely dangerous. The rim of Dead Man's Ravine, a nearly vertical cliff face that had been the site of several fatal accidents over the years. By 5 p.m., Ranger Walsh had assembled a search team of 6 park rangers and 12 volunteer search and rescue personnel. She briefed them on the situation: experienced hiker, missed check-ins, GPS data showing him moving off trail toward a dangerous ravine. The team divided into 3 groups, each taking a different approach route toward Michael's last known coordinates. The first group followed the Appalachian Trail to the point where Michael's GPS showed him leaving the marked path. Ranger Tom Morrison, who led this group, found the spot easily based on the coordinates. What he didn't find was any sign that Michael had actually left the trail there. The undergrowth was undisturbed, no broken branches, no footprints in the soft earth beside the trail, nothing to indicate someone had pushed through into the woods. Morrison radioed this information back to Walsh. "GPS says he left the trail here, but I'm not seeing any evidence of it. Ground looks completely undisturbed." Walsh found this puzzling but not impossible to explain. Maybe Michael had been careful about his path, stepping on rocks to avoid leaving traces. They needed to push further into the woods toward his last known location. The second search group approached from a Forest Service road that provided access closer to Dead Man's Ravine. This team, led by veteran search and rescue volunteer Marcus Webb, had the advantage of starting closer to where Michael's GPS had stopped transmitting. Webb's team moved carefully through dense forest, calling Michael's name, listening for any response, looking for any signs of passage. The third group consisted of 2 rangers with technical climbing experience. Their job was to descend into Dead Man's Ravine itself, in case Michael had fallen or climbed down and become strapped unable to climb back up. Descending the ravine safely required ropes and harnesses, and even with proper equipment it was slow and dangerous work in the fading daylight. As the sun set at 7:43 p.m., the search teams were spread across the wilderness calling Michael's name into the growing darkness, sweeping their flashlight beams across trees and rocks, hoping to see reflected light from Michael's gear, or a response from Michael himself. The temperature was dropping rapidly, forecast to reach the low 40s by midnight. If Michael was injured and exposed, hypothermia would become a serious risk. The technical climbing team reached the bottom of Dead Man's Ravine at 8:15 p.m. Their flashlights illuminated a chaotic landscape of boulders, fallen trees, and a narrow creek running through the ravine floor. They searched systematically, checking every space where a person could be, behind rocks, under fallen logs, in the creek itself. They found nothing. No sign that Michael Palmer had ever been there. At 9:30 p.m., all 3 search teams regrouped at a central staging area to compare findings. The result was baffling. Despite hours of searching the exact area where Michael's GPS had placed him, they had found 0 evidence of his presence. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no dropped items, no blood, no torn clothing, nothing. It was as if Michael Palmer had simply ceased to exist at 1:14 p.m. Ranger Walsh made the decision to suspend the active search until morning. Searching in darkness was dangerous for the rescue teams themselves, and without any clear direction about where Michael might actually be, They risked spreading their resources too thin. A larger, more systematic search would resume at first light. Sarah and Robert Palmer drove to the ranger station that night, unable to stay home while their son was missing. They met with Ranger Walsh, who explained what the search teams had found, or more accurately, what they hadn't found. "The GPS data just doesn't match what we're seeing on the ground," Walsh told them. "We searched the entire area around those coordinates. Your son's not there." "Then where is he?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. Walsh had no answer. The search for Michael Palmer resumed at 6 a.m. on April 15th with an expanded team. Word had spread through the hiking community about the missing young man, and over 40 volunteers showed up to help. Fellow hikers who understood that when someone disappeared on the trail community responded. The volunteers were organized into grid search teams, each assigned a specific area to search with systematic thoroughness. A helicopter from the North Carolina State Highway Patrol joined the search, equipped with thermal imaging cameras that could detect body heat through forest canopy. The helicopter flew a pattern over the area where Michael's GPS had placed him, the pilots and observers scanning their thermal displays for any sign of a heat signature that might indicate a person. K-9 units arrived by mid-morning. Search and rescue dogs, trained to track human scent, were given items from Michael's apartment to establish his scent profile. The dog followed the same path and stopped at the same location, unable to detect any scent beyond that point. Over the following 3 days, the search for Michael Palmer evolved from a rescue operation to a recovery mission, then to a criminal investigation, and finally to a complete mystery that defied explanation. More than 200 people participated in the search at various points, covering hundreds of acres of wilderness. Every inch of Dead Man's Ravine was explored multiple times. The Appalachian Trail itself was searched for miles in both directions from Michael's last confirmed location. Investigators found Michael's car exactly where he'd parked it, locked and undisturbed. Inside was Michael's wallet, left intentionally because he didn't carry it while hiking, and a jacket he hadn't needed given the warm weather. Everything was exactly as Michael would have left it for a routine day hike. On April 17th, 4 days after Michael disappeared, a hiker found Michael's cell phone. The phone was lying on the Appalachian Trail itself, about 200 yards past the point where Michael's GPS showed him leaving the trail. The phone's battery was dead, but when investigators charged it and powered it on, they found that the last activity on the phone was Michael's 12:47 p.m. text to his mother. There were no calls made or received after that, no additional texts, no photos taken, nothing to explain what had happened. The location where the phone was found created another paradox. If Michael had continued along the trail past the point where his GPS showed him leaving it, that meant the GPS data was inaccurate or had been tampered with. But GPS specialists examined Michael's device and found no evidence of malfunction or manipulation. The device had simply recorded Michael moving off trail, even though other evidence suggested he'd stayed on the trail longer than the GPS indicated. The FBI got involved in the case on April 19th, 6 days after Michael's disappearance. Special Agent David Chen, who specialized in missing persons cases in wilderness areas, took over as lead investigator. Chen had worked dozens of cases involving hikers who disappeared on various American trails, and he knew that most of these cases fell into predictable categories. The hiker had an accident and died in a location that searchers hadn't found yet. The hiker deliberately disappeared for personal reasons, or in rare cases, the hiker encountered another person with criminal intent. Agent Chen's investigation explored all three possibilities. Could Michael have had an accident that left him incapacitated in a location the searchers hadn't covered? Possible, but increasingly unlikely as the search area expanded without finding any trace. Could Michael have deliberately disappeared? Chen investigated this possibility thoroughly, interviewing Michael's friends, professors, and family, looking for any indication of depression, financial problems, relationship issues, or other factors that might motivate someone to vanish. He found nothing. By all accounts, Michael was happy, healthy, doing well in school, close to his family, and excited about his future. The third possibility, that Michael had encountered another person, became the focus of Chen's investigation. Had someone been on that section of trail who hadn't come forward? Someone who might have seen something or, worse, been involved in Michael's disappearance? Investigators interviewed every hiker who had signed trail registers in the days before and after April 14th. They found and spoke with the 6 hikers Michael had mentioned seeing during his hike. They checked for any registered sex offenders or individuals with violent criminal histories who lived near the trail. They investigated whether there had been any other unusual incidents on that section of the Appalachian Trail in recent months. One interview produced information that seemed potentially relevant. A hiker named Patricia Morrison told investigators that on April 13th, the day before Michael disappeared, she had encountered a man on the trail who made her uncomfortable. Morrison described him as approximately 40 years old, average height and build, wearing a brown jacket and carrying a large backpack. What made Morrison uncomfortable was the man's behavior. He had asked her detailed questions about where she was hiking, whether she was alone, where she'd parked her car. Morrison had given vague answers and quickly moved on, but the encounter had stuck in her memory as odd. Morrison also mentioned something that seemed minor at the time but took on potential significance in light of Michael's disappearance. The man had mentioned being a trail angel, someone who helped lost or injured hikers. He'd told Morrison that he spent a lot of time on this section of trail, specifically to help people who got into trouble. The concept of trail angels was well known in the hiking community. They were generally kind people who provided help to hikers, giving rides to trailheads, offering food and water, providing information about trail conditions. They were one of the positive aspects of trail culture, experienced hikers helping those less experienced. But Agent Chen recognized that the trail angel identity could also be an effective cover for someone with predatory intent. It established trust immediately and gave a perfect explanation for approaching hikers and asking them personal questions about their plans and whether they were alone. Chen's team created a sketch based on Morrison's description and distributed it to media outlets asking anyone who recognized the individual to come forward. They also reviewed trail camera footage from several wildlife cameras that had been set up for a research project in the area. The cameras had captured hundreds of hikers passing by in the weeks around Michael's disappearance, but none of the images matched Morrison's description clearly enough to identify a specific individual. As weeks became months with no breakthrough in the case, the investigation began its inevitable transition from active pursuit to cold case status. Agent Chen continued working the case, but other responsibilities demanded his attention. The search for Michael Palmer had evolved into something that investigators privately acknowledged might never be solved. Sarah Palmer refused to accept this possibility. She created a website dedicated to finding her son, posting all available information about his disappearance and asking anyone with knowledge to come forward. She organized regular volunteer search parties that continued exploring the wilderness around the Appalachian Trail every weekend. She gave interviews to local news stations, keeping Michael's case in the public eye. Robert Palmer dealt with his son's disappearance in a different way, becoming obsessed with understanding the GPS data that had led searches to an area where Michael seemingly had never been. Robert taught himself about GPS technology, satellite positioning, potential sources of error and interference. He spent hundreds of hours analyzing Michael's GPS track, looking for patterns or clues that professional investigators might have missed. What Robert discovered was that Michael's GPS data showed something beyond just his final movements. When Robert mapped out all of Michael's previous hikes using GPS data from his Garmin device, he noticed that Michael had passed near the area of Dead Man's Ravine multiple times before, never as close as the GPS indicated on April 14th, but close enough that Michael would have been familiar with the general terrain. This contradicted the initial assumption that Michael had wandered into an unfamiliar and dangerous area. Michael knew where Dead Man's Ravine was, and would have been unlikely to approach it carelessly. Robert also discovered something else. On 2 of Michael's previous hikes, his GPS data showed brief, unexplained gaps where the device stopped recording for periods of 10 to 15 minutes before resuming. At the time, these gaps hadn't seemed significant. GPS devices sometimes lost satellite lock in areas with heavy tree cover or when passing through narrow ravines. But looking at these gaps with the knowledge of Michael's disappearance, Robert wondered if they meant something more. The investigation into Michael Palmer's disappearance produced hundreds of pages of reports, dozens of interviews, multiple search operations covering thousands of acres, and no answers. The GPS data remained inexplicable. The lack of any physical evidence remained baffling. The absence of witnesses to whatever happened remained frustrating. The case was officially classified as a missing person investigation with suspected foul play, though investigators couldn't prove that anything criminal had occurred. Years passed. The series included a 2-episode deep dive into Michael Palmer's case, examining all the strange aspects of his disappearance: the GPS data that didn't match physical evidence, the found cell phone, the dog that lost Michael's scent, the possible trail angel encounter. The podcast brought renewed attention to Michael's case and generated hundreds of tips that Agent Chen's team had to investigate. Most tips were well-intentioned but useless. People who thought they'd seen someone matching Michael's description years after his disappearance in locations far from North Carolina. A handful of tips seemed potentially credible and required significant investigative resources to pursue and ultimately eliminate. One tip that generated particular interest came from a caller who identified himself only as a concerned hiker. The caller told investigators that there were unmapped cave systems in the area where Michael disappeared, caves that didn't appear on any official maps or geological surveys. The caller suggested that Michael might have entered one of these cave systems voluntarily or otherwise, which would explain why searchers never found him above ground. Teams of experienced spelunkers explored the area around Dead Man's Ravine, looking for openings in the rock face, sinkholes, or other features that might indicate cave access. The search took 3 weeks and covered an extensive area. The spelunkers found several small rock shelters and a few minor crevices, but nothing that would be described as a significant cave system, and certainly nothing large enough for a person to enter and become lost in. The cave theory, like so many other theories about Michael Palmer's disappearance, led to another dead end. In March 2019, 6 years after Michael disappeared, 2 amateur spelunkers named David and Jennifer Kim were exploring off-trail in the wilderness near Dead Man's Ravine. The Kims were experienced cavers who had explored hundreds of cave systems throughout North Carolina, always looking for new and undocumented caves to map and photograph. On March 17, 2019, David Kim noticed something odd about the rock face near the bottom of Dead Man's Ravine. There was a section where water runoff had created unusual erosion patterns, and when David examined it more closely, he realized that behind a thin curtain of vegetation and a jumble of fallen rocks, there was an opening in the rock face, a dark space that seemed to extend back into the cliff. The opening was small, maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, and it was positioned in a location that would be extremely difficult to reach without climbing equipment. But for experienced climbers like the Kims, reaching it was challenging but feasible. David called to Jennifer, and together they carefully climbed to the opening and peered inside with their headlamps. What they saw was the entrance to a cave system, a passage extending back into the rock at a slight downward angle, large enough for a person to crawl through. David and Jennifer looked at each other with excitement. This was exactly the kind of discovery they lived for, an unmapped cave in an area that had been supposedly thoroughly explored. The Kims spent the next hour carefully exploring the cave entrance. The initial crawl space opened up after about 20 feet into a larger chamber, maybe 15 feet across and 8 feet high. From this chamber, multiple passages branched off in different directions, suggesting an extensive cave system. The Kims knew they needed proper equipment and permits before exploring further, but they took GPS coordinates of the entrance and photographs of what they could see. When the Kims returned home that evening, David did what he always did after discovering a new cave. He searched online to see if the cave had been previously documented. He entered the GPS coordinates into various geological databases and cave registries, finding no records of any known cave at that location. Then, more out of curiosity than any expectation of results, David searched for news articles about the area around those coordinates. The search results that came back made David stop cold. Article after article about Michael Palmer, the hiker who had disappeared in April 2013. David quickly realized that the cave entrance he and Jennifer had discovered was less than a quarter mile from where Michael Palmer's GPS had shown him on the day he vanished. David immediately called the ranger station and reported what they'd found. Within hours, Ranger Walsh, who had coordinated the original search for Michael Palmer 6 years earlier, was organizing an expedition into the cave system. By the next morning, a team consisting of park rangers, FBI agents, professional cave rescue specialists, and the Kims themselves was assembled and prepared to explore the cave thoroughly. The exploration team entered the cave at 9 a.m. on March 18th. They moved carefully, mapping the cave as they went, documenting every passage and chamber. The cave system was more extensive than initial observations had suggested, with passages branching and interconnecting in complex ways. Some passages were comfortably large, allowing normal walking. Others required crawling or squeezing through narrow spaces. At 11:23 a.m., in a chamber approximately 200 feet from the entrance, and 60 feet below the surface, the exploration team made the discovery that answered 6 years of questions and raised new ones. In a small side chamber, lying on the cave floor with his backpack still strapped to his shoulders, was Michael Palmer. The team's reaction was a mixture of relief at finally finding him and grief at the confirmation that he had not survived. Michael's body was in remarkable condition given the 6 years that had passed, preserved by the cool, stable environment of the cave. He was positioned on his side, as if he had laid down to rest and never woken up. The recovery operation took several hours, requiring careful work to bring Michael's remains out through the narrow passages of the cave system. By late afternoon on March 18th, Michael Palmer was finally brought out of the cave where he had been for 6 years, less than 200 feet from where search teams had looked for him in 2013, hidden behind a small opening that nobody had found. The autopsy performed on Michael's remains revealed the cause of death: hypothermia combined with dehydration. There was no evidence of physical trauma, no signs of foul play, no indications that Michael had been injured or attacked. The medical examiner concluded that Michael had entered the cave, presumably seeking shelter or exploring, and had been unable to find his way back out. The cool temperature of the cave, which had preserved his remains so well, had slowly drained his body heat until hypothermia set in. But while the cause of death was clear, the how and why remained mysterious. How had Michael found the cave entrance? The opening was in a difficult-to-reach location that required climbing skills to access safely. Michael had no climbing gear with him on April 14th. The search teams in 2013 had explored the base of Dead Man's Ravine multiple times without finding the cave entrance. How had Michael found it? And more puzzling, why had Michael entered the cave in the first place? He was an experienced hiker who understood wilderness safety. He knew that entering an unmapped cave alone without proper equipment was extremely dangerous. Nothing about Michael's personality or experience suggested he would take such a risk. The investigation into these questions led Agent Morrison to examine everything found with Michael's body. His backpack contained the water bottles, snacks, and emergency supplies he'd packed that morning. His cell phone was not present. That had been found on the trail, suggesting Michael had dropped or discarded it before entering the cave. But there was one item that hadn't been on Michael's equipment list, something his parents confirmed he hadn't owned: a headlamp. A small LED light that hikers wear on their forehead to illuminate the path ahead in darkness. The headlamp was a critical piece of evidence. It suggested that someone had given Michael the headlamp, knowing he would need light to enter the cave. It suggested that Michael hadn't stumbled upon the cave by accident but had been led there by someone who knew it existed. Agent Morrison returned to Patricia Morrison's statement about the man who claimed to be a trail angel. Could Michael have encountered this person? Could this person have told Michael about the cave, perhaps describing it as a shortcut or an interesting geological feature worth exploring? Could Michael have trusted this person enough to follow their directions, accepting the headlamp they offered? The theory fit the facts better than any other explanation. Michael's GPS data showed him moving quickly and purposefully toward the ravine, as if following specific directions. He'd been heading directly toward the location where the cave entrance was later discovered. The headlamp indicated someone had prepared him for entering a dark space. Everything suggested that Michael had been intentionally led to the cave. But by who? And why? Morrison reopened the investigation into the trail angel lead, re-examining all the information they had about the man Patricia Morrison had described. She also made a decision that would crack the case wide open. She requested that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit create a profile of the kind of person who might use the trail angel identity to harm hikers. The profile that came back described a perpetrator who would be deeply familiar with the local trail system, who would have legitimate reasons to be on the trail frequently without raising suspicion, who would have knowledge of the terrain that went beyond what typical hikers possessed, including awareness of features like the hidden cave system. The profile suggested looking at people who worked in the area, park employees, trail maintenance workers, or long-term local residents who spent significant time on the trails. Morrison's team began systematically investigating individuals who fit this profile. They reviewed employment records for everyone who had worked for the Park Service or trail maintenance organizations in 2013. They interviewed local residents who were known to spend time on the trails. They checked criminal background records for everyone in these categories. One name that appeared during this investigation was Thomas Whitfield, a 43-year-old man who had worked as a volunteer trail maintenance coordinator for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy from 2009 to 2015. Whitfield had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation in 2013 as part of the routine process of talking to everyone associated with the trail, but he hadn't been considered a suspect. He had no criminal record, had provided a routine statement about not seeing anything unusual on April 14th, and had never come up again during the investigation. But when Morrison looked more closely at Whitfield's background, some concerning patterns emerged. Whitfield had been a volunteer on 3 different sections of the Appalachian Trail over a 15-year period, moving from one section to another every few years. In 2 of those sections, hikers had disappeared under circumstances similar to Michael Palmer's case. Experienced hikers who left the trail for no apparent reason and were never found. In 2008 in Vermont, a 24-year-old woman named Rachel Chen had vanished from the Appalachian Trail. Her GPS data, like Michael's, had shown her leaving the trail and moving toward difficult terrain. She had never been found. In 2011 in Virginia, a 31-year-old man named David Roberts had disappeared during a day hike. His phone had been found on the trail, like Michael's. He had never been found. Thomas Whitfield had been working as a trail volunteer in both locations during the times of those disappearances. Morrison obtained a warrant to search Whitfield's property, a small house in the woods about 20 miles from the section of the Appalachian Trail where Michael disappeared. The search, conducted on April 12, 2019, nearly 6 years to the day after Michael vanished, found evidence that would close multiple cases and reveal a predator who had hidden behind the trusted identity of a trail angel. In Whitfield's basement, investigators found a collection that documented his crimes. Photographs of hikers he'd encountered on the trail, including photos of Michael Palmer taken on April 14, 2013. Maps of the Appalachian Trail with locations marked, including the cave system where Michael had been found. Journal entries describing his interactions with hikers, written in clinical, detached language that revealed how Whitfield selected his victims. Young, fit, hiking alone, trusting. The journals revealed Whitfield's method. He would identify a potential victim, approach them as a trail angel offering help or information, engage them in conversation to build trust, then tell them about a special location they should visit. A hidden waterfall, a spectacular view, a unique geological formation. He would give them specific directions, sometimes even walking part of the way with them, ensuring they went where he wanted them to go. The locations he directed them to were always dangerous. Hidden caves like the one where Michael was found, steep ravines, areas with unstable ground. Sometimes his victims died from the environments he led them to, as Michael had. Sometimes they simply disappeared, perhaps finding their way out but too traumatized to report what had happened, or perhaps dying in places that would never be found. Whitfield had done this because he could, because the trust that hikers placed in trail angels gave him access to victims, because the wilderness erased evidence, because he could return to the trail day after day, presenting himself as a helpful volunteer, and nobody suspected that he was hunting. Thomas Whitfield was arrested on April 12, 2019, and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and related crimes across 3 states. His trial began in January 2020, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The journals alone would have been sufficient for conviction, but investigators also found physical evidence linking him to the victims, items belonging to Rachel Chen and David Roberts, the 2 hikers who had disappeared in Vermont and Virginia, kept as trophies in Whitfield's basement. Whitfield's defense attorney argued for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, citing Whitfield's cooperation with investigators in providing information about other potential victims and locations where remains might be found. The prosecution, representing the families of Michael Palmer, Rachel Chen, David Roberts, and 2 additional victims whose disappearances Whitfield confessed to, argued that Whitfield's systematic predation over more than a decade warranted the harshest possible punishment. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentencing phase lasted another week, during which family members provided impact statements describing how Whitfield's crimes had destroyed their lives. Sarah Palmer spoke for 30 minutes, addressing Whitfield directly and describing the 6 years of not knowing what had happened to her son, 6 years of hoping Michael might somehow still be alive, and the complex mixture of relief and grief that came with finally knowing the truth. She described how Michael's disappearance had frozen their family in time, preventing them from properly mourning and moving forward. She talked about the birthdays and holidays that had passed with Michael's absence aching like an open wound, and she described the particular cruelty of Whitfield's method, using the trust and goodwill of the hiking community, using the trail angel identity that represented the best of human nature, to facilitate evil. On February 14, 2020, Thomas Whitfield was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read, maintaining the same detached demeanor he'd displayed throughout the trial. The resolution of Michael Palmer's case brought closure to his family, though closure proved to be a complicated concept. Sarah and Robert Palmer finally had answers about what happened to their son, finally could properly mourn him and eventually lay him to rest. But the answers came with the knowledge that Michael's death had been preventable, that a predator had operated on the Appalachian Trail for years without detection, that the trail angel identity Michael had trusted had been a mask for something monstrous. The case also prompted significant changes in how the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and National Park Service managed volunteer programs and responded to missing hiker reports. Background checks for trail volunteers became more thorough, including psychological evaluations for anyone in positions of regular contact with hikers. New protocols were established for investigating hiker disappearances, including immediate exploration of unusual GPS data, rather than assuming equipment malfunction. Trail registers began including more detailed information about who was on the trail when, creating better records for investigations. Perhaps most significantly, the hiking community itself changed its approach to the trail angel tradition. The concept of trail angels didn't disappear. The genuine kindness and helpfulness that most trail angels represented remained a valued part of trail culture. But hikers became more cautious about trusting strangers, more aware that not everyone claiming to offer help had good intentions. The balance between maintaining community trust and exercising appropriate caution became something the hiking community actively discussed and tried to navigate. Michael Palmer's remains were cremated, and his ashes were scattered on a section of the Appalachian Trail he had particularly loved, a gentle stretch through wildflower meadows in the spring. Sarah and Robert established a scholarship at North Carolina State University in Michael's name, supporting students studying environmental science who demonstrated the same passion for wilderness that Michael had shown. The cave system where Michael was found was closed to public access, the entrance sealed to prevent others from entering and potentially becoming lost as Michael had. The cave exists now as a tomb and a memorial, holding the final hours of a young man who loved hiking and trusted the wrong person. The question that haunted Sarah Palmer after everything was resolved, the question she sometimes asked when she couldn't sleep, was whether Michael had realized what was happening to him as he explored deeper into that cave, following directions that led him further from the entrance and deeper into darkness. Had there been a moment when Michael understood he'd been deceived, when he knew he was in terrible danger? Or had he died still believing he was having an adventure, following a trail angel's recommendation to see something special? The medical examiner suggested that Michael had likely become disoriented in the cave system relatively quickly, that the complex maze of passages would have been confusing even for someone with caving experience. Michael probably realized within an hour that he was lost, that the cave was much more extensive than he'd been led to believe. He had tried to find his way back out. His footprints in the cave dust showed movement through multiple chambers, but the darkness and the complex layout had defeated him. Eventually, exhausted and hypothermic, he had stopped in that side chamber, laid down with his backpack and lost consciousness. It was, as the medical examiner put it, a peaceful death in the end. Hypothermia causes confusion and eventually unconsciousness without much pain. Michael would have simply fallen asleep. But the hours before that, when Michael knew he was lost, when he was trying desperately to find the exit, when he was alone in the dark with his water running out and his body temperature dropping, those hours would have been terrifying. Sarah preferred not to think about those hours. She preferred to remember Michael as he was in that photo he sent at 8:47 a.m. on April 14th, standing at the overlook with visibility for miles, happy and excited about the perfect day on his beloved trail. The hiking community remembered Michael Palmer too. In 2021, a memorial plaque was installed at the trailhead where Michael had begun his final hike. The plaque featured Michael's photo and a simple inscription, Michael Palmer, 1994-2013. Beloved son, passionate hiker, and a reminder that we must protect each other on the trails we love. Thomas Whitfield, serving his 5 consecutive life sentences in a North Carolina maximum security prison, has never expressed remorse for his crimes. In a brief statement to investigators after his conviction, Whitfield described his actions in purely functional terms, as if he had been conducting an experiment in human behavior rather than ending lives. Psychologists who evaluated him diagnosed him as a psychopath with exceptional ability to mimic empathy and manipulate trust, exactly the kind of predator who could successfully disguise himself as a trail angel for over a decade. The FBI's review of cold cases involving missing hikers conducted after Whitfield's arrest identified at least 3 additional disappearances that showed patterns consistent with Whitfield's method. GPS data showing movement away from trails found cell phones' lack of physical evidence at the scene. These cases remained officially unsolved because Whitfield never admitted to involvement and no evidence connected him definitively, but investigators privately believed he was responsible for more deaths than he was convicted of. For the Palmer family, the years after Michael's case was solved were about learning to live with definitive knowledge rather than tormenting uncertainty. The grief didn't end, but it changed shape, becoming something they could carry rather than something that paralyzed them. Sarah returned to teaching, finding purpose in education and in the scholarship program they'd established in Michael's name. Robert eventually retired and became an advocate for wilderness safety, giving talks to hiking groups about the importance of communication protocols and situational awareness. Michael's story became part of Appalachian Trail lore, one of those cautionary tales that experienced hikers tell newer ones, not to discourage people from hiking, but to encourage appropriate caution. The trail remains one of America's treasures, walked by millions of people who experience nothing but beauty, challenge, and the kindness of genuine trail angels. But Michael Palmer's name serves as a reminder that evil can exist anywhere, that trust must be balanced with awareness, that the person offering help might not be what they seem. The final photograph Michael took before entering that cave, the last image recovered from his phone's memory, showed the area near Dead Man's Ravine with dense forest and rocky terrain. In the bottom corner of the frame, barely visible, was a human figure, too distant and blurry to identify clearly. Forensic analysts who examined the photo believed the figure was Thomas Whitfield, captured unknowingly by Michael's camera minutes before Whitfield convinced Michael to follow him to the cave entrance. Michael Palmer was 19 years old when he died, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, killed by someone who exploited the trust that makes outdoor communities special. His death was a tragedy that rippled through his family, his friends, the university community where he studied, and the hiking community he loved. But his death also led to changes that likely saved other lives. Better volunteer screening, improved search protocols, increased awareness of predatory behavior on trails. If Michael could know that his death prevented others, that the investigation into his disappearance exposed a serial predator and protected future hikers, would that provide any comfort? His parents liked to think so. They liked to believe that Michael's love for the trail and for helping others would make him glad that something positive emerged from something so terrible. The Appalachian Trail continues. 2,190 miles of wilderness path connecting Georgia to Maine, walked by dreamers and adventurers, by people seeking challenge and beauty, by those running from something and those running toward something. Most who walk it will complete their journeys safely, carrying memories of spectacular views and personal achievements. They'll encounter kindness from trail angels, genuine ones who offer help without expecting anything in return. They'll experience the profound sense of accomplishment that comes from pushing their bodies and spirits through challenging terrain. But some who walk the trail will hear Michael Palmer's story and will remember to balance trust with awareness, to maintain communication with family, to think carefully before following a stranger's recommendation to leave the marked trail. They'll remember that even in beautiful places, danger can exist. They'll remember Michael's trust that was betrayed, and they'll be more careful about who they trust. And perhaps that's Michael's legacy. Not just the scholarship bearing his name or the memorial plaque at the trailhead, but the countless hikers who walk the Appalachian Trail with a little more caution, who check in with family a little more reliably, who think twice before following someone off the marked path. Lives saved by awareness. Adventures completed safely because people remembered what happened to a 19-year-old environmental science student who loved hiking and made one tragic mistake. Sarah Palmer still hikes sections of the Appalachian Trail occasionally, always on the anniversary of Michael's disappearance, always covering the route Michael walked on that last perfect spring day. She hikes it for him, carrying his memory with her, seeing the views he saw, walking the path he loved. And at the end of each hike, she whispers the same thing. "I'm home safe, Michael. I'm home safe."